Hello, my name's Eloise Schottler. I'm your storyteller. Welcome to Stories in Time. Often on this program, I talk about how stories come about for storytellers. How do you pick out something, and what do you do when you want to put it together? In the process, I'll tell you a little bit about the story too, but that's what I'm going to do today. One of the things, I'm working on a brand new story, and when you get really deeply into working on a brand new story, it's hard to think about much else, or to tell a different kind of story. I'm so into this place. Let me go back and start at the beginning. I knew that I was going to register for the 2014 Capitol Fringe in Washington, which will be this July. And about 8 months ago, I started thinking about what would I want to do for the Fringe. It would be a one-person show. It would be at least an hour. And what kind of a story would I want to tell? And I knew that I wanted to talk and to tell a story that came from World War I. Now, why? I tell personal stories. And what personal could I have about World War I? I'm old, but I'm not that old. But I did have a grand uncle that died in World War I. He was a young American soldier. He was in France, and 3 days, I think, before the armistice, he died of the Spanish flu. I'd always been sad about John Walter because he was buried in Saint-Mihiel Cemetery in France, and only his mother went to his grave. She went one time in 1930 when the government offered the Gold Star pilgrimage trips to mothers and wives who had sons and husbands buried overseas. Well, would John Walter really be a story? So I started looking around for that, and I wasn't sure. And I also was looking for a woman's story. I have a background of telling women's stories, of being a feminist advocate for the Equal Rights Amendment. That's my major interest. And so I went down to the Women's Military Memorial at Arlington and talked to the curators and to the staff down there. What did they know? Did they have much on World War I? And I had this story about my family, but I wasn't sure. And one of the staff members said to me, "Eloise, do you know about the Hello Girls?" I doubt that you know about the Hello Girls, really. I'd never heard of the Hello Girls. So I said, "No, I don't." So she gave me a couple of write-ups, and I got a book out of their bookshop about women in World War I. And when I read about the Hello Girls, I was captivated by them. Nobody knows about them. It's an unknown story about women. And I was enchanted by them, the girls themselves, the young women. And then I got to the end of that story, and I knew that this was the story I wanted to tell because it connected with me personally, not because I'd been in France in World War I. Oh no. It connected with me because I'm a woman living in the 21st century in the United States of America. And what happened to them is still happening. Shall I go back? When General Pershing got to France, he was the general that was in charge of the American Expeditionary Force when they went to France in 1917. The Americans were coming in later. They needed the infusion of the American soldiers. They needed the strength, the help, everything. And listen, America's a melting pot. So all of Woodrow Wilson's neutrality, all of those policies that kept the America out of the war were not popular with everybody because we're a country of immigrants. And at that time, the immigrant might have been just off the boat or one generation, and the ties to the home countries were very strong. So there was an undercurrent of feeling for the war in Europe, and there were sides taken. That's not hard to imagine that that could happen. But in 1915, when the German subs sunk the Lusitania, and so many people were lost, and of those were more than 120 Americans, the feelings began to rise, and that actually was the pivot that eventually sent the United States into that war in 1917. Well, when General Pershing got to France, he discovered that the French telephone system was not as refined, not as efficient as what he was accustomed to in the United States and what he knew he would need to lead the battle, because you had to be able to communicate and communicate effectively and communicate quickly with the battlefields in order to get your troops and everything in place and to do what you wanted to do. He saw how wonderfully the British had organized the women and what they were able to do to help with the war effort. And he sent back and asked for the Army to find, recruit, and bring over as fast as they could 100 American telephone operators who were bilingual and who spoke French as well as they did English. Now, why would he have done that? Why would he have singled out American women telephone operators? Well, it's because that was the job for women by 1917. When things started out and the telephone systems grew, first they had men operators, and it just didn't work out. I mean, you know, pushing those cables into those holes and switching the calls around, that wasn't a man's job. And the next thing, they tried boys, thinking that, well, they'd have smaller hands, it would be easier for them to work the switchboards. And boys were too rambunctious, and that didn't work out. And so the job of telephone operator fell exclusively to women. And wasn't that a lucky thing? Because it gave women a job that wasn't in a factory, it wasn't being a domestic, and it wasn't on a farm. They had another occupation to choose from, and many women did. College graduates, high school graduates. The problem came for them in finding the French speakers. They hadn't realized that they would be a problem. They thought maybe they could go to Louisiana and find French speakers down there, or French Canadians or what, and it just wasn't that easy. Then they finally figured it out. It was turned over to the Signal Corps, and they figured out that they needed to recruit French speakers, not necessarily telephone operators who were French speakers. They could train them as telephone operators, but they had to have the language first. And they advertised. They put out advertisements all over the country. 7,000 women applied. Of course they did. They had strong feelings, and they wanted to get involved, and they wanted to do something in the war effort. They saw the men going, and they wanted to have a part. There were two sisters in San Francisco who had been born in France and were now American citizens, and they were telephone operators, and they, of course, were native French speakers. They joined. Others joined. In the end, they chose 233. As many telephone operators, some supervisors came, operators, and then they chose women who were good French speakers and trained them. 233. They went over in groups of 33, 6 units, and then added women where they needed them. The first unit that left from Hoboken, New Jersey on March the 6th, 1918, was led by a woman named Grace Banker. Grace Banker was a graduate of Barnard College. She'd gone right in to be a telephone operator, and then she was a supervisor for the telephone company. She was highly trained. She could train the people. She could lead this group. It was the first group to go over on a troop ship loaded with troops in the bowels, in the hold. Do you know how they did that? They stacked them up 7 bunks high. 7 bunks high, those guys were riding. They went at night, of course, in night crossing the Atlantic. The ship was on blackout. They were in submarine off waters. It was scary and terrifying. Grace Banker reports that 4 or 5 of the 12 nights, the women were ordered to sleep with their clothes on, and they understood what that meant. They expected the possibility of a torpedoing. They trained every day, you know, with the lifeboats. They reached England. There's an amazing story that she has left that I'll tell you. I'll bring her to life for you in the story. That's my goal, to bring Grace Banker back to life and let her tell us what it was like leading those young women, the first group, what she called the pioneers that were going over, to set up the switchboards, to man them, to speak the French, to get used to that atmosphere, and to be able to respond instantly to a request for a connection between the units of the Army, to get the orders out and to get the replies back in. They had some very harrowing experiences, I can tell you. Absolutely. They served until after the end of the war. The telephone operators served through the peace treaty meetings in Paris. And then they were released. Now, they had been recruited by the Army, by the Signal Corps. They wore the uniforms, which they had to pay for themselves, that the Army prescribed. It had Army buttons on it. They wore this insignia of the Signal Corps. They were paid by the Army. They were directed by the Army. They reported to the officers, etc. So when they were sent home, when the war was over and they went home, they expected their discharge and the commemorative medal that everybody that served was given. One woman wrote for it to the Department of the Army, and she got a letter back. You're not eligible for your medal. You're not a veteran. You were not a member of the Army. You're not a member of the Army. They had served in France, so close to the battlefield, they could hear the rumble and they could see the flashes at night. They were not a veteran. These were not ordinary women. And they fought for their rights for 60 years until 1979, when finally Congress acknowledged their service, acknowledged that they were veterans, and the Army sent a general to each woman still living to give the discharge papers and to thank her for her service. Of 233, there were 18 still alive. Don't you want to hear that story? Can you hear modern echoes in it? I sure could. And I'm glad I'm having a chance to tell it. The Hello Girls. Thank you very much.